Welcome to Living in Harmony, a podcast for Christian parents who want to make the peace in their household without sacrificing their sanity. Here, we talk about everything from sibling rivalry to dating and how to raise your kids to be strong in their faith while maintaining your own. But don't worry, we're not all preachy here. That's the purpose of your church and your pastor. Here, we're here for you, to help you know you are not alone in this crazy journey called parenthood. So whether you're a seasoned pro or a brand new parent, Living in Harmony, this is the podcast for you. So grab some coffee or wine, we won't judge, and join us as we navigate the ups and downs of raising kids in a Christian household where the gospel is the center. Well, welcome to Living in Harmony. If you're tuning in today, it's a good day for us here in the studio because we finally have like the studio desk. It's been a while. It took a few months to get it made. We still got to get the room all quiet and everything, but finally we've landed. My name is Delmar.
I'm Robert.
And I'm April.
And it's a good day. And we hope that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that this will add a little bit of value to your day. The conversation we're going to have today is, I'll be honest, it's not an easy one for me to have if I have it honestly. I can have this conversation very dishonestly, but if I'm going to have this conversation honestly, it's not easy. But before we get into that, what I want to ask you is, what did y'all get into this past week? It's been a couple weeks since we've been able to meet. What did you get into?
Well, most recently, we were surprised with our daughter coming home for a quick visit, an overnight visit this weekend. So we got to see her Saturday night, and she came with us to church Sunday and got to hang out some that afternoon. That was unexpected and very appreciated.
Yeah.
Oh, and I've just been building garden boxes for April. So
oh yeah, there's that too. That was so exciting.
The garden box extravaganza. Yeah. Us this week went to Lancaster, South Carolina last week and picked up the bar we're sitting at. And then my dad came over and we stained it and polyurethaned it and all that fun jazz. So it's just
looks amazing.
It's gorgeous.
It's fun. So, it's kind of like a pipe dream that we've been able to actually have a thing where we can sit around and talk. We have game nights. We can play them over here. But overall, it's been a week consumed with getting this place ready. Mother's Day is coming up. So we're which is also my middle child's birthday. So we're having a big to-do thing here. So trying to get all the house, because we're having both sides of the family over and all that stuff. So now, today, as we step into this, I just want to just throw this word out there and just get a reaction. Okay, now, let's get the honest reaction. Okay, not the church reaction. Ready? Forgiveness.
Depends on which side I'm on. I mean, if I'm the one who's done something wrong and I need to be forgiven, I love it. If I'm the one that
Wait, what? If you've done something wrong?
Yeah, if I've done something wrong, I love forgiveness.
Okay, I get it.
If I'm the one who's done something wrong. But if I'm the one that needs to be doing the forgiving, I don't like it that much, I'll be honest.
Yeah. Forgiveness is not easy. And I think that's, to me, a qualifier of if you're actually doing it. I was actually thinking about this last night. The one place where you don't want to give grace is probably that's the space where forgiveness needs to happen the most, at least in my experience. So today, what we're going to be talking about is not just forgiveness. I mean, we should be having that. Your pastor should be having that conversation with you in church from behind the pulpit. You should be encouraging each other in your groups with that. But we're going to be talking about how this is so important in our family life, in our modeling it for our children, and just beyond that, like what it communicates to them. So we're going to get into a couple things today. We've got about five brief areas we want to touch on when it comes to like how does forgiveness interact with our parenting and our children. So first of all, and we don't want to bypass this, and that is this: when we're practicing forgiveness in the house, it really is the foundational aspect of our Christian faith, right? Because I mean, that's where Jesus came and died. So as we ease into that first point, that it is the foundation. When we show forgiveness, this is the door opening to show our children who Christ is.
Yeah, and I don't think you can overemphasize that point. I mean, it really is key, and it doesn't just allow us to talk about our faith with our kids. It allows us to have good relationships with our kids. As we recognize Christ's forgiveness and the impact of that on our relationships with other people.
Yeah, and as we, you know, demonstrate forgiveness in the family, I think it's important that we draw some guidelines of what it really is. I've been walking through some families with our church dealing with forgiveness lately, and one of the parent figures in the relationship looked at their child who they had wronged and said, "You need to just forgive me." And just stepping in that with that child, and then the child, the student, felt guilty because they're like, "Oh, my mom told me to forgive. I haven't." I'm like, "Well, do you hate her? Are you bitter? No, or not? You know?" I'm like, "Well, then walk me through that." And it's important to delegate that forgiveness is different than trust.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
true.
It's so much different. Forgiveness is, I'm not going to hold this against you, spiritually speaking. I'm not going to I'm not going to carry this bitterness. Forgiveness is the willful giving away of the bitterness in a lot of ways. But that doesn't mean that you just get trust back. So when we're practicing forgiving, whether it be us down to the kids or when we mess up kids, us, it's important that we communicate, "Hey, I forgive you, but trust is something different." And once we were able to kind of draw those boundaries, it was very healthy for the family to realize, oh, he has forgiven, but there's a trust thing that's going on here. And what's so beautiful about the gospel is that, I mean, if you think about it, Christ forgives us,
Right.
and then he gives us trust in the sense of carrying out his message and being a part of his providential will. Like, what does that say about him in relationship to us and how that should funnel down to our kids?
Yeah. And, one of the things that I think about with respect to forgiveness, you were talking about forgiveness versus trust, is we're commanded to forgive. And we're not necessarily required to trust everyone in all situations at all times, obviously. There are oftentimes that we're told to discern things and be mindful and careful of, we're cautioned against, certain types of people in God's word. But we're commanded to forgive, just like we're commanded to love. It's a decision, it's a choice, and from God's perspective, it's not negotiable. It's something we should do.
Yeah. So as we show our kids that it is a foundational aspect of our faith, I would encourage that it's also important. Let your children know when you have forgiven them. Oh my gosh. Could you imagine being a Christ follower and not knowing that you're forgiven? That's the difference between assurance of salvation and not.
Yeah.
And when we forgive our children, sometimes we're just like, I've seen this. A parent's like, their child does something wrong. They're like, whatever, I'm over it. And then but they don't communicate that to their child. So what is the student left thinking?
Sometimes that means, especially for young kids, that means they're still expecting a punishment. They're still expecting something, and it's like Dan's been talking about in the sermons, and we'll get there, is our primary, like our default reaction, our default interaction, way to interact with other people is in some sort of justice, right? A right and wrong. And if I do something wrong, there needs to be punishment. And if you do something wrong, I need to punish you. It's that retribution type of mindset. And so kids just sort of have that instinctively. And if they know they've done something wrong and you don't communicate that it's over, they could be waiting for that to happen for days or even weeks, for a long time. They're still waiting. Oh, is dad going to come back and punish me for that thing? And I think you're right. It's very important that we communicate that it's over.
Another thing that I think that you're communicating to children in that situation is that you're modeling unforgiveness for them to follow in your footsteps. And if you don't actually let them know you have forgiven them and let them see that you forgive others, then they don't know that you have forgiven. And, they watch what we do. And, in the same way, if we don't ever have a practice, we've talked about this before, apologize to your child when you wrong them. We have to own up to it. We can't just say, well, I'm the parent, so I'm not going to lower myself and apologize, to my 6-year-old when I, got, overreacted over something or got overly angry. I mean, we have to apologize and admit our wrong, even to our children when they're young. In the same way, forgiveness, we have to let them know they're forgiven, and we have to model that for them because, we teach them and they learn from us.
So you're saying that, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that even if we have forgiven them, if we don't tell them, they don't learn the right lesson because they don't see explicitly that we're forgiving?
That's what I'm saying, yes.
Yeah.
Did you just wife-splain?
No,
I
I
think
was
he did,
actively
Delmar.
listening.
Yes, I think he did.
I actively listened and repeated
so you
back
were
what I thought
reflecting.
she had heard,
Okay.
what I thought she had said.
No, I think
Good
that
save,
that
good
was
save.
very good. That was very good. No, but seriously, that is so key and foundational that we communicate to our children when we forgive them. That, like April said, we seek it, forgiveness, when it's needed, because it really is. It's the core of what the cross offers us. And when we don't model that in our home, then that makes the cross even that much more foreign in our children's lives, which brings us to, the next aspect of forgiveness in our family, because Jesus came down. He didn't accidentally trip up and die on a cross to forgive us. He came
Right.
down here with a mission, and his mission was, this is what I'm doing. It was an act of choice. And today I want to encourage this, and this is a really hard one to say. And if you listen to this podcast, and maybe this isn't even in your family, this is just life, this is really hard to do. But we have to acknowledge, number 2, that forgiveness is a choice. That's so different, because it's easy for me to be like, forgiveness is a feeling. And when I get around to it, when I am emotionally ready to do it, I'll let it go. You're not, because when you hold on to unforgiveness, it just turns into bitterness, and it spools around longer. So it's a choice. So let me ask you this: in your rearing of children, right? Are there times when it took you longer to forgive? Or
Absolutely.
how did you work through that? What went through your mind? Like, how did you communicate that? How did you deal with God on that?
I think just in general principles for me, I can't wait until I feel like forgiving to do it. I have to decide to, and then as I go to God with that and say, that my favorite passage in all of Scripture, I think, is when the man's wanting his child to be healed, and Jesus says, "Hey, if you believe," and he's like, "I believe, help my unbelief," right?
Yes.
And so that's how I am with forgiveness most of the time. If I'm really honest, it doesn't come natural to me for anything significant, and I have to commit to doing it and acknowledge, to God that I'm going to, and then ask Him to help me make the feelings follow. So that's for me how I have to pursue it. And when dealing with the kids, I had to do that too. I mean, it was, if there were things that I had done, usually with me, it was overly harsh discipline or being too quick to jump on something, tended to be how our parenting partnership went. I had the justice and she had the mercy bent.
Most of the time. And then other times it was like, whoa,
Yeah.
there goes mom.
Yeah. When those reversed, the kids knew there was something wrong. But
Good cop, bad cop really threw him off that
Yeah.
day. Yeah.
But yeah, so those were things that I had to kind of acknowledge and say, this is something I need to do because it's right, and then let the emotions follow later.
And as a parent on the younger end, my oldest is about to be 6. I've seen in family that for the first few years of your life, if your kids make a mistake, they're not out actively, willfully trying to connive you. The first place that they're probably going to experience forgiveness is how mom and dad treat each other. And generally in a lot of relationships, because the way God puts us together, he doesn't put us together clean, because we're there to sharpen each other. And,
Right.
there's generally one who can arrive at mercy and grace a little quicker than the other. And in every relationship, it's different. And what I've seen and what I've experienced is forgiveness is just saying, I'm going to fall on the sword for the sake of being a good parent in front of these children, right? And I'm going to love you even when I go off on my wife or she goes off on me. They have to see that mommy and daddy they're willing to work through it. So forgiveness isn't, I will choose to forgive my spouse once she comes around.
Right.
Your children need to see you choosing to forgive your spouse, even when one of you is still mad at the other one. Let the one, choosing that. And because that's a lot of times the first place where our children are going to actively see forgiveness. They're going to, of course they will, as they get older and their wretchedness kicks in even more. But I think that, and then, so how much of the kiss and make up process is healthy to display in front of your children, you think?
I think something that you said in there is really important, that they see the decision to be made. And I think there were times in our raising of our kids where we would say things like, I'm still angry, but we're going to do this thing that I don't feel like doing. You know, I'm still angry, but I forgive you. I'm still angry with this, and I'm working on that. I don't think we did a ton of talking about our disputes with each other in front of the kids, but we did make sure that we communicated that our relationship was foundational and strong. You know, we never joked about divorce. We never talked about,
privately or publicly.
Yeah, privately or publicly, but in front of the kids especially, we tried to make sure that they understood that this bond was extremely strong. I don't know. We'd probably have to ask the kids if they felt like we reconciled in front of them. And
honestly, I mean, I think the vast majority of our married life, we've pretty much gone with the assumption that most things are the little things. Most right. issues are not worth fights. And so, I mean, there have been times, there's definitely been times where one of us has been mad at the other for whatever reason, but we have always been, I would say 99% of the time, quick to want to resolve and say, we're not going to go down that crazy way. Right. We're just going to, we're going to work through this really quickly and stay,
and when
solid together.
And when you do that, that's modeling Christ. He publicly forgave us in the most public debasing way possible. And I would encourage you, if you're in a marriage and you're like, man, we're in a tough spot, or we're about to go in. Jesus was publicly debased in his act of forgiveness. It is okay for you to feel like dirt when you're forgiving someone, because that's honestly love, right? And it doesn't mean that, like you said, trust is just back. That can be earned. But it is a choice that you have to step into.
Something that kind of came to mind as we were talking about this is early on in our marriage, I don't remember how early, but I would say I think it was definitely within the first 5 years of our marriage. We just had discussions between the two of us about our own upbringings and things like that. And I had, made the comment that I never saw my parents have an argument through the whole, my whole life. I don't recall that. And I remember Robert saying, well, I'm sure they argued. They just probably didn't do it in front of you. And I thought, no, I really don't think they ever really had fights or anything. And so, just because it was sort of like not a bet, but a bet that wasn't a bet, I was like, I'm going to call and find out. And I picked up the phone and called my mom, and I said, hey, weird question, but we're just having this discussion. And I flat out asked her, I don't recall you guys arguing. I just don't recall a time where I heard you guys fighting or arguing. And I told her, Robert's convinced that you guys did. It just was maybe behind closed doors so the kids wouldn't know. And I just asked her flat out, what really, what can you shed light on about that? And she just said, no, I don't really think we did. But the backstory for that is both of my parents had been previously married before, and the details aren't important, but they had both experienced a spouse commit adultery, and they had ended up, with their marriages ending. And so when you go through something, when you know how bad things can be, and you know how much hurt there is to experience, she told me, she said, we just decided when we got married, most things are not worth the argument because we know how much worse it can be. And they just committed early on that they were going to let most anything just, roll off. And that's how they lived. And so it really was true that they really didn't argue that like that.
but their ability to forgive was birthed out of some deep pain.
Absolutely.
Some deep pain. And if we're not forgiving in our own house, chances are there's some deep pain we have not processed. We've not worked through. We've not given to the Lord. We've not even maybe owned. And when we choose to forgive, I think what's really difficult is because we think, oh, well, we've forgiven. We tell our children we forgive them. They're like, oh, we should be able to be back fine, which brings us to the next point. Because forgiveness is a choice, but number 3, reconciliation is a process. Right. It is a process to be reconciled. Jesus, he offers us forgiveness, but what did he have to do for us to be reconciled?
And I think that's a really profound point. And we've talked about it April and I have in our life and with our kids about having, forgiveness doesn't mean dropping all the boundaries, right? Sometimes that means, I think you said earlier, trust. Sometimes that means that there's a different kind of trust, and there's a boundary that goes up that may never come down. But I think forgiveness is a choice that I make in my heart and before God. But reconciliation requires both of us to be involved, right? So if the other person doesn't want to be a part of a relationship anymore, I can still forgive. I can still be clean before God. I can still offer that to that person. But that doesn't mean that relationship can reconcile, because if the other person's not interested, you just can't get there. That reconciliation does require both.
And if you're listening, you're a parent with an older child, I know that we have some who listen who have some children who they don't speak to. And I think I would offer, it doesn't dull the pain of not having your child in your life, but if there is a schism that has created a need for forgiveness and that you've chosen to do that, but for whatever reason, the reconciliation has not happened, there's only so much you can play into that. It takes both parties coming together saying, I want this to be reconciled. So, I think sometimes as a parent, we can beat ourselves up about, this problem. And it's not even with our kids, just people in general. There's people who I would love to be reconciled with. I've offered forgiveness, but for whatever reason, here I am. Does that make them less of a human? No. Does that make me better? No. It's just, it requires both people desiring to do it. And the thing about your family is this is one of the most critical places, especially with everybody under the same roof, where we learn how to reconcile. And I know for me, my mom, I don't know if I ever shared this before, but when I would get in a fight with my brother, she would make us sit on the couch and hold hands.
I think I heard that
for
before.
Sometimes an hour, man. You know how hard it is to be like a little kid watching Power Rangers holding your little brother's hand. You don't feel cool at that point, or having to watch his Barney because we're in the same room. Now I got to watch Barney and hold his hand. Yep. But in that moment, what my mom was teaching is reconciliation it's a process. It requires you being close to each other. It requires you to be in communication with each other. And it's important that we pass that on to our children, that they can be reconciled. Man, this breaks my heart. I was speaking to a student this week, and you can just tell when somebody's off. And I said, hey, what's up? Nothing. Well, I believe about 60% of that.
Right.
What's going on? And then it was, boom, my parent, this, and I don't want to get into it, but It was I'm hurting because this child's getting silent treatment, which is one of the worst things you can probably do, in my opinion, aside from physical violence on your children.
Yeah.
Is is this silent treatment, and just seeing the longing for reconciliation to happen, and just feeling hopeless. And I think that's the one thing I would share with parents. I've seen this a lot when parents are unwilling to reconcile with their children until they go through a phase of getting shunned or a phase of whatever. It just burns into the soul this feeling of hopelessness
And rejection.
And here's the person who's supposed to love me, birth to me. You know, if anyone should be in my corner, it's this person. And when they're no longer there, man, it'll mess up your worldview. So it's important. And to which I told this person, you need to go and talk to your adult figure, because I said, have you shared this with him? No. This is tough. You need to, which is sad, because it shouldn't be doing that. But sometimes we lead up, right? That's what we do. Sometimes other adults encourage children to lead up. I know you have, I have, but it's a process. It requires getting messy. But if anything I could say is, when I'm talking to this student, it's like there are shackles on their heart. They don't even want to share stuff they need to be sharing with their parent. And which brings us to point number 4. And this one is, man, if you unlock this in your family, I don't even know what you call it. Next level. You call it biblical. How about that?
Yeah.
I love number 4.
Yes. Number 4 is probably my favorite one. And that is this: forgiveness brings freedom, because unforgiveness, it just holds us captive.
Yeah.
To the bitterness, to the hurt, to the anxiety, to the what if. It brings freedom.
I think I've even possibly shared this before on a previous podcast, but one of my favorite little sayings that I will talk about with people when things like this come up is, and I don't remember where I heard this long ago, but I've stolen it and used it ever since, is forgiveness. Forgiveness is setting the captive free and realizing that the captive was you.
There you go.
And it really does speak to the fact that this is not about whether the other person deserves it. Just like Christ's forgiveness for us was not a matter of whether or not we deserved it, because clearly we did not. But, forgiveness is more about us modeling Christ and our own spiritual life and our soul, being in the right place. And it does not, it does not matter if that other person has repented, admits they're wrong, whether you're able to reconcile, but for our own spiritual health, we have to do it. And really interesting thing is that I think deep down in our hearts, we know if we have truly forgiven someone or not. And a lot of times it's very easy to say the words, yes, I forgive that person, but all the while we still have our fists closed over at least a portion of something, going, yeah, except for this, I reserve the right to flare up over this part right here,
I've learned you can be 95% forgiving, but the 5% can drown you.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And I think whenever you experience forgiveness, being able to let go, it really is like coming up for air. I want to encourage you, if you're dealing with it, what's the place, what's the person, what's the event that you just can't, what occupies your mind space? Most of us have something. I have something. Here's what I practice this every now and then, and it's helpful, and I think it's very human. I will just go to a place where I'm comfortable. Sometimes it's just being in my backyard. And for just a second, I don't want to use the word make-believe because that's not the appropriate word, but I will just allow my mind to be like, what if it never happened? And I just sit in that. And I experience, it's like getting hit with cold water. And then it's like, that's what it could be like. Because when you forgive, your soul can be put back in that place. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes I'll go right back into the hole right after that. But it's important that you allow yourself to experience and feel that freedom, even if it's just for 10 seconds before the anxiety comes up. And next time you say, okay, Lord, let's do it again. Let's do it again. I went through something when I was like 24. I had to wake up every single day before I got out of the bed. I had to say, I choose to forgive this person. 2 years. 2 years. Over 600 days, I had to wake up before I got out of the bed. I choose to forgive this person, and Jesus is Lord. You know, the choice happened. The feeling came later. And you know what? The second you choose to forgive, great, you'll have freedom. But then life is life, right? So there'll be something else. But I would encourage you, if you're like, I'm not at a place where I can do that, I can't release it, at least allow yourself to feel for a second what I know God can do in your life permanently.
Yeah, and if I could mix a couple of metaphors that you guys threw out there, April talked about, there's always something that you hold on to, and you just picture grasping onto that with your fist. And Delmo, you talked about drowning, and if you remember what it was like to learn how to swim, the first thing you really have to do is learn to trust the water and trust that you can float and relax, right? Yep. You have to let go. And I think forgiveness is very much the same way. If you don't trust that God can do what he does and restore your relationship with him, if not your relationship with that other person, although that's always possible, you have to let go of that and trust him, and that allows everything else to happen. If you don't, you end up drowning, just like in the water. If I clinch up and I'm trying to, it doesn't matter how much I'm thrashing against the water, it's going to get worse, and I'm going to drown myself if I do that. You have to be able to relax and get into that. And I think an exercise like you just talked about is a really good way to do that, because the way I know you wanted to be careful with it, but I like the way you talked about pretending, because you allow yourself to get out of the reality. It's like, no, I can't really do that. No. Let's pretend like I could for just a minute and see what it's like, right? And then you start practicing that, and you can feel the tension relax out of your body probably. And then as you do that, you kind of build that skill set that allows you to do it for real.
It becomes more of a habit. And, to continue with that, just this past week we were at the pool with my kids, and I'm trying to teach my middle how to float on his back. And man, I would put my hand on his back, and his legs would go straight. And when they went straight, I'm like, you're going to sink, boy. And then I would kind of let him go. I'm not, I let him fall, freak out, like, now, relax. I want to see those legs just wiggle out there. And then he would start floating. And it's so real, because the second he's floating, it's almost like this thing in his mind. It's like, there's no way this can be real. I got to tense up to control the situation. Start sinking again, which brings us to our last point, and that is this: forgiveness is an ongoing journey. My son, he's buoyant, he's in the water, he's relaxed. All of a sudden he tenses up. Oh, no, you got to relax again. It is an ongoing thing. It's not, like we were just saying, it's not a one and done thing. If it was, well, that would be, it will be that way when we're in glory. But as long as we're trapped in this, we can't, because we are so, our emotions and our logic are so intertwined. One is always holding captive the other.
Right. And I think, again, I really like that illustration of floating, because the other thing is, if floating in a pool is one thing, but if you've ever tried to float on your back in the ocean or in a place where there's or in a pool where people are splashing, it's like, oh, it's working really well until a wave, until water comes over my face, and now it's like, and our instinct is to tense up and try to stand up, which is about the worst thing you can do if you're floating, because you don't float vertically. And so then you have to consciously relax and just kind of let that wash over you. You have to let that wave wash over you. It doesn't mean you can breathe while it's there. It may be very unpleasant for that moment, but then it settles back down, and you're able to refloat again. And one of the techniques that I've used, and I've used it with my kids, and I've used it with my wife and with other people, is to think about, to kind of practice, thankfulness and gratitude. Part of that is with God, because like half the verses on forgiveness that are in Scripture are we're to forgive because God forgave us. We're supposed to remember, we've talked about that a couple of ways. We're supposed to remember what we've been saved out of and what Christ did to save us and what it cost him. And that makes all of our other things seem much, very petty. But the other thing is to look at that other person, whether it's a kid, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member, and start looking at the good things about that person. There's almost always something. I mean, very few humans are complete and total monsters. There's always something that you can look in there and say, oh, that's pretty good. And for most of us, there's a good bit in the behavior. For those of us who are Christ followers and who are striving to raise our children that way, there's a lot to be thankful for. And every time I look at April, every time I've looked at my kids, there are so many things that I could be grateful for, so many good things that they do, so much in their hearts that was trying to follow Christ. And I look at that and say, oh, with all of that on one side, is it really worth me being angry about this little thing? And that has helped me to say, no, it's really not. That's a small thing.
And what I hear you doing right here is something that's so common that we should be doing, and that is you are preaching to yourself what you know to be true. And I think if we don't do that, then what ends up happening is our subconscious self preaches to. Somebody's always preaching to us, right? You're either going to let that redeemed side of you preach to yourself, which requires effort, or you're going to let that autopilot version of you preach to yourself, which is horrible, because we know where that leads to. And as we sit in this today, when it talks about forgiveness, our hope is that no one listening feels like, oh, this is ridiculing me. Our what we're trying to say is we all struggle with this, but we have something in our arsenal that enables us to do something supernatural in regards to forgiveness that the world can't figure out. The world, I'll give this to the credit to the culture. Our culture has at least recently owned the fact that they're not forgiving and can't be, because that's why we have cancel culture. That's why we have boycott, right? They call it consequence culture, but that's whatever. It's cancel culture. And every time you hear that, cancel this person, cancel that, they what they're saying is they're just owning the fact that naturally we cannot truly forgive. Forgiveness is a supernatural event. It's what designates us different than those who don't have Christ, which brings us to this great aid in this conversation, which was what we heard in church this week. Yeah. So let's talk about what we talked about in church this week, because man, it pairs up real nice. So this past week, Pastor Dan, we're going through Galatians right now, and he is hammering it in. And ultimately, you could summarize what we talked about this past week is this. And here it is, everybody. This is no veil on this conversation. A Christian is someone who looks at everything in life through the lens of the gospel. Everything.
Amen.
Oh my gosh. Today I was working on our sermon clip, and we put out our sermons every week at church. We put a clip, and then Dan was just going on about like the richness of the word and how that's the center of worship. And we open that, we hear from God, and I'm like in tears while I'm making this thing, because this is the most normal thing ever. It should be, right? Like the most normal thing ever should be that the gospel is the center. It's what we go to every week, but I'm emotional because it's not normal anymore. Even in our church world, we're not coming back to a gospel. What do we come back to? You ready to come back to? We don't come back to the gospel. We come back to our mission, vision, and values, which is fine, but they're only supposed to be there as a handmaiden to the gospel. And what we see is that when we look everything through the lens of the gospel, we're able to see the pathway towards forgiveness. We're able to see the pathway towards living in such a way where we don't need forgiveness as much. So as y'all were sitting in the sermon, I really love to hear how this interacts with this conversation that we're having right now in your minds.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's a fantastic, it's a fantastic pairing, and there were several things that came back. One of the things that Dan's first point was, what does it mean for the gospel to define our relationships? Well, one of the things it means for the gospel to define our relationships is what we've been talking about. We forgive because Christ forgave. We recognize that truth. We recognize that that's where the relationship our relationship with God comes from. It's not based on our performance. It's not based on how well we honor Him or follow His commands. It's not based on some set of religious practices. It's based on what Christ did for us and how much He loved us to reach down into our sin, to reach down into the muck that we had and we were, and to pull us out of that. And when we keep that in mind, and then we turn and look at other people who are in exactly the same spot as we are, then, what right do I have to be angry with my wife when I was that, slime ball that Christ had to pick up? Really, when I keep all of that in mind, it allows me to have a much better relationship with other people and to really have the power, the strength to do those things that I wouldn't be able to do in my own nature.
So would you say that having a gospel filtered approach to relationships doesn't just change your emotional state of being, but it changes your actions as well?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think in our culture today, we're really zoinked out on just wanting to feel better and have our emotional state better. But what we have to realize is like the gospel's not there as an emotional enhancer. It is there for a life enhancer, which does. And man, Dan really, even afterwards, my own father came up to me after. He's like, man, that sermon got me. And my dad's a good old country boy, so, because Dan, he just straight up said, if the gospel defines your relationships, then you need to target right now who's someone you need to forgive, who's someone you need to apologize to, who's someone you need to encourage, and who's someone you need to confront, and who's someone you need to pray for, and who's someone you need to serve. If you just identified those 5 things and you're like, that's my goal for the next month, could you imagine what that would do?
Yeah.
Just to our ability to be relational with people. Could you imagine like our children seeing this, praying for someone at the dinner table who you've never done before, I look at that. And then he went on to talk about how the gospel should dictate our priorities as well. And, you think about that. Are we being intentional about, passing off the gospel in our family? A lot of Christians they're Christians, but the gospel transmission is passive in the family structure, right? Passive gospel is we take our kids to church, we take them to VBS, we listen to K-Love. Man, you can find better stuff than K-Love. But I'm just saying, this passive. But if we're going to let the gospel dictate our priorities, then how should our communication with our children about Jesus really be?
It changes it. I think it changes everything, because every time we interact with our kids, we should be conscious of, we are essentially presenting the gospel in one way or another in all of our interactions, and
I think the other thing it does with that is it's not just how we speak with our kids, it's how we choose to use our time individually and as a family. We're not going to, we may not, we may turn down this sports league because it would require us to be there on Sundays when we should be fellowshipping with our believers. We want to make sure that we are doing things, even in that sports league. No, we're gonna be loving and forgiving to the person who just committed a foul against you, right? You're gonna get up and you're gonna forgive that person, and you won't feel like it, right? But you're not gonna get up and hack that dude just because he hacked you, right? A lesson I didn't learn very well in high school, but
I've heard stories of you in your high school.
Me and my high school
sports team.
But we can allow the gospel to influence our behavior in all of those different ways, and you can multiply that into hundreds and thousands of examples to be able to do that. It's not just our words, but our actions as well.
But when we bring it home, and it's the lens through which all of the way we view the world, the way we view relationships, the way we view our behaviors and our choices and the priorities that we make, we're modeling that for our kids, and we're teaching them that our Christianity and our relationship with Christ is not just something that's compartmentalized on, well, it's part of Sunday morning, it's part of Wednesday night. There's times where that's part of it, and that's, but we live it and we breathe it. And it's what shapes everything about how we view everything. It shapes how, like you said, it shapes how we interact with people who wrong us. It shapes how we have compassion for people who are hurting. It shapes how we see people who are struggling with things that are different than things that we struggle with. Right. And, it shapes how we treat others. And, there's a difference between letting that be the lens through which you filter all of life versus just a portion of your week is devoted to going there.
Because if it's going to inform your whole priorities, I would just encourage church is not Sunday, just Sunday mornings. Mm-hmm. We did our due diligence. We put in some time with Jesus. That's not it. That's not us making the gospel a priority. That's making us the gospel. I think about it like ice cream. Okay, because ice cream is awesome, right? In moderation.
Mint chocolate chip, yeah.
Moose tracks. Okay, but I'm just saying, this is the way that a lot of us tend to default, those who are Christian, to the gospel. Is like, here we go. You have the ice cream, which is your life. Here it is. It's on display. And then I'm going to put the sprinkles on top, which is the gospel. So everybody can see the little sprinkles. No, it should be the ice cream is the gospel. That's our life. That's where all the flavor is. That's everything. And the sprinkles is how that is expressed out. I've sat in a church before where that's how the gospel presentation was. It was every week, here is this TED Talk. And then the last 3 minutes, maybe 4, I'm going to apologize for how mean Christians are. And then I'm going to sprinkle, but Jesus is good. Forgive us. Here's the gospel, like sprinkles. And what you get out of that is you realize there's not a whole lot of substance in there, right? Mm-hmm. If you ever, as a kid, one time I wanted to eat some sprinkles because I thought they were awesome. I just got a spoonful of them. They're gross, right? What it should be is it should be the whole foundation of what we got going on. And it should dictate our priorities because, back to the ice cream, if you don't have the ice cream, where do you put the sprinkles? If you don't have the gospel, how can you prioritize the other things in your life? How can you prioritize how you're going to educate your kids? How can you prioritize how you're going to think politically? How can you prioritize how are you going to be in the culture? You can't do it without the foundation of the gospel, which brings us to our last one. And this one is huge. And this is the one we want to send everybody off with today. And that's this: the gospel must inform our mission. And this is important because this is different than just prioritizing, because priorities is how we set it up. Mission is how we live it out. And man, I go yard selling almost every Saturday with my dad. And my dad's got this worker with him named Mike. I know this. If I'm out with Mike, someone is getting witnessed to. He wears specific shirts when we go yard selling. It's just like, Jesus loves you. And when we hit the yard sales, he asks them, how you doing? They say, good. And they always ask, how you doing? Because this is the South. And he says, God is good. And if they say, yes, he is, he says, oh, do you know Jesus? But this happens at like 5. Sometimes we're like, come on, man, we got to go. But he's sitting there. But sometimes people say, well, you say he's good. And he'll say, well, why do you think he's not good? Next thing you know, he has the gift of evangelism. But I look at him as an example of that's a guy where the gospel informs his mission in life. Like it affects what he wears, what he says. And honestly, it's kind of a role model type way to look. But even if we look at that in our own lives, it's important to see how is the gospel pushing us to live, to make decisions. I know that y'all have made decisions even in church life was completely bent on the gospel, where you attend church, So have you ever seen, or how have you encouraged your children? Okay, you're going to believe this. This is what you got to do. Have you ever had to lean in with that? This is what you got to do if you're going to believe it.
Oh, yeah. And I think that was...
Can we even count the number of ways?
Like thousands of times. Their whole lives have been that way. I mean, because we we had decided, in our, as our relationship was forming, I mean, both of us were already following Christ at that point. And so our marriage was going to be built that way. We were raising our children that way. Everything from, what we fed them to how we educated them to, what activities they were involved in, all of those things were circled in, were subsumed under, this sharing the gospel with them and having them be part of that mission for our marriage, our family. That mission was to create, children who would be, Christ followers themselves, under the sovereignty of God and understanding all of those theological things. So it's not to say that following a formula guarantees the outcome, but yeah, we absolutely did that. And we, as they got older, it was now into, thinking about career choices, thinking about education choices. Do you go to college or not? Where are you going? What are you trying to what is your education going to look like, and what are your career plans? All of that was in some sense driven by our coaching them through this whole process of trying to follow Christ and have the gospel be relevant in their lives.
Because ultimately it's not just what you believe. It's got to filter out in how we're treating our neighbors, how we're treating each other. So that's the big encouragement. The full circle back around is, okay, if we're going to live out the gospel, then it's going to result in us being forgiving. It's going to result in us seeking forgiveness. And what happens when we can push that down into the DNA of your family is this: your family is freed. It is free. If you want your family to be free, guide them in the path of righteousness that leads in the ways of forgiveness. If they won't do it, okay, you do it. Just do it. You have nothing to lose by modeling Jesus. So that being said, it has been great hanging out today. I hope that wherever you're at, like we said, whatever you're doing, maybe you feel like you have a little bit more harmony. My name's Delmar.
I'm Robert.
And I'm April.
Have a great rest of your week.